Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Saturday, 19 August. It will be fine but cloudy in the evening with highs of 22 degrees Celsius or 71 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:41 a.m. and sunset at 8:09 p.m. We are on the 19th day of the Warsaw Uprising. Did you all know that Poles were not the only ones fighting in the uprising? But we'll tell you more later. Alina, what is happening otherwise?
Yeah, thanks for that, Philippe. It's a really interesting point that there were more than just Poles fighting in the Warsaw Uprising. But we're going to start off today with Claire. Claire, you want to go down a slightly different road today, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the Warsaw Uprising doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think it's important that we remember what's going on elsewhere in the war as well, especially the bigger events. And obviously we've had D-Day. That's part of the reason why they call the Warsaw Uprising when they do, because the Allied forces are coming in from the west, Soviet forces are coming in from the east. And as the liberatory forces come in through continental Europe from the west, they are pushing through France, of course. I have to say that the liberation of Paris wasn't really an Allied priority. But as the forces come close, the population of Paris rise up on their own. The French resistance takes control. And then we are sort of precipitates the Battle of Paris, which will be the liberation. And I just think it's such a contrast to what's happening in Warsaw. Here we have two European capital cities, both rising up their populations to liberate themselves. Paris rises up and the German forces withdraw as the Western Allies close in, whereas in Warsaw the population rises up and the Germans are reinforced. It becomes a real point of honour, it's not really strategic, but a huge significance to Hitler to absolutely bend this city to the will, to get rid of the Poles. And the Soviet forces are holding themselves back. So it's kind of like the opposite of what's going on in Paris. And Paris will go on to be liberated after just 6 days of fighting and largely intact. You know, the beautiful, dreaming Paris, that city of spires, that remains, whereas Warsaw will be bombed, almost completely obliterated. Another beautiful, gorgeous European city. In fact, Jan Novak, who is our radio journalist who is reporting back from Lightning Radio in Warsaw during the uprising, he noted that 5 European capitals fell while Warsaw waited in vain for relief by the Red Army. And they can still see those Red Army battalions encamped, if they climb to any rooftop in the city. And after the liberation of Paris, Novak broadcasts this salute in French. He says, "We are fighting for the same ideals. Vive la France! Vive la Pologne! Vive la liberté!" Not everyone is so generous, really. I mean, Zoe, who is this female resistance fighter serving in the Warsaw Uprising, she writes later that Paris was taken by the Allies in a flash, and it's hard not to read a little bit of contempt and misery, really, in that. She knows that Warsaw is struggling and suffering on. It's already been nearly 3 weeks, and they're going to be struggling on for a time unknown while the Parisians are toasting their liberation. And as they're making these announcements, it's quite clear that the Home Army aren't going to be able to hold the old town for much longer, and the situation is getting only worse in Warsaw.
Yeah, I think it's a really good illustration of one of the sort of fundamental points of the European war is that the Eastern and the Western wars, if you like, were not the same. The conditions were not the same. Primarily the attitude of the Germans were not the same, but also of the Allies coming in. So actually this sort of juxtaposition of Paris with Warsaw in 44 really helps us to sort of solidify that idea. And you're absolutely right. You look at the way Paris is essentially surrendered intact. I mean, there were plans to destroy much of it, but they weren't put into operation by the Germans.
And that was the German commanders on the ground. They refused to do that because they saw Paris as a city of lights. They'd very much enjoyed their years of occupation there.
And they didn't enjoy the occupation in Warsaw. That's the difference.
Yes, exactly. But so that's a key point here, is that the German command and others, they viewed Paris and they viewed the French as a nation of culture and a nation worthy of respect and being maintained, which they never did of the Poles, and they never did of points east beyond Poland. So they viewed that, to everything to the east of themselves as being a sort of an uncultured wasteland. So the idea of actually, being defeated by those uncultured Poles was a humiliation to the Germans. Whereas, they could quite relatively happily surrender Paris. They were never going to surrender Warsaw to the Poles, because that was a humiliation. So there's that element of it. But then also, the next point as well, Claire, which you allude to when you alluded to just now, is the attitude of the Allies as well. That the Western Allies allow, I think I'm right in saying, allow General Leclerc to sort of spearhead the forces that march in and liberate Paris. So they're effectively allowing the French to liberate their own city. Whereas, as we know, as we've talked about in the east, in Warsaw, that's the last thing that the Soviets want to allow. They want the patriotic Poles to be humiliated and destroyed before they march into a ruin.
Now we've put a little bit of context into what's happening across the rest of Europe. Where are we with the Warsaw Uprising? What's happening on the ground?
Yes, Claire, there's a lot happening on the ground. I'm going to start with the general attack of Heinz Reinefart's battle group. For those of you who may have either skipped the episode or just really didn't listen to what we had to say, I'm just going to go back on it a little bit and just remind you who he was. So Heinz Reinefart was responsible for forming a combat group to suppress the Polish uprising. His men were incorporated into the forces commanded by Erich von den Bach-Zelewski, who Roger kindly described him as a provincial accountant a couple of episodes back. Anyway, coming back to him, a little bit of a side note about Reinefart is that he never actually paid for his crimes against the Polish nation. He became a respected mayor in 1951 of the town of Westerland, and he proved to be a really good administrator, and he turned the town on the island of Sylt into a resort, basically. The problem here is that the Allies considered him to be an important witness during the future Nuremberg trials and refused to extradite him. And then shortly afterwards, even though he was briefly arrested on the suspicion of war crimes, the courts ultimately ruled that there is no evidence. I think, to be honest, that's absolutely ridiculous. There's plenty of evidence that he was involved in many, many war crimes. Over the years, the Poles tried to extradite him, and the Germans just kept refusing. And he's responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, especially those civilians who were massacred in Wola and Ochota, between 40 to 70,000 people over 3 days. And he never took responsibility for his crimes. He, quote, says he was ordered to do it. So if you get a chance to actually watch him on videotape, it is so infuriating to watch this man basically pretend he's completely and utterly innocent without having blood on his hands. It's crazy. Anyway, so the assault begins on the Old Town today, on the 19th day. It involves, I'm going to rattle off a list here, it involves 10 infantry battalions, 2 engineer battalions. They were supported by 9 Tiger tanks, 20 assault guns, 600mm mortar, the car, we spoke about that a couple of days ago, a gunboat that was coming up and down the River Wisła, or the River Vistula, and armour trains, and 50 Goliaths. And one of the platoons which participated in the attack was supported by fire from another armour train that was located near the Gdańsk railway station, which is in the northern part. It's just north of the Old Town. So if you ever come to Warsaw, it could be one of the train stations that you use if you decide to catch a train. Anyway, so the insurgents managed to repel a lot of the attacks. Unfortunately, a couple of houses were completely and utterly destroyed, but the Poles are holding firm. They're holding steady at the moment. But there's also a lot more happening on the ground. Roger, tell us a little bit more about what's going on there.
Yes, the Germans attacked the College of Technology, University of Technology, on the 19th. It was, a strong point of the insurgents, of the Home Army, and the Germans attacked it, and it results in very fierce fighting over this over the 19th of August, where they're basically going from building to building, and they're not often from floor to floor, with fierce hand-to-hand fighting. The Germans, as we know, attack with all the means at their disposal, so they have tanks as well involved, in artillery, and of course the Goliath miniature tank, or miniature tracked mine, we can call it, which was used to great effect in Warsaw generally. As I said, they're sort of fighting from building to building. And by the end of that day, Poles, in the main building of the university, all of the ground floor is on fire due to this German attack. and the Poles, under the command of Major Kazimierz Falewicz, order that all of their units should be evacuated, which they then do through the sewers and get them out that way. But it's a brutal day with heavy losses on both sides, and most of the university buildings are destroyed in the process.
Looking at the international picture again, the bigger context, obviously we've talked a little bit about what's going on in France and the juxtaposition of that with the position in Warsaw. But I think it's also interesting to talk about the Hungarian forces that are involved in the Warsaw Uprising. Of course, Hungary is now an ally of Germany officially, but a lot of the Hungarians were quite friendly towards, even supportive of, and some of them joined the fight with the Polish insurgents, didn't they? Roger, you've got a bit on this.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the Hungarians, as you said, were allies of the Germans, and that's goes back to their history in the end of the First World War, and the sense of having been hard done by the end of the First World War and so on. So Hungary was one of those revisionist powers, and so aligned itself with Germany. Yeah, it's interesting with the Hungarians, because they are sort of rather torn. They were, of course, German allies at this point. They were, to some extent, strategically and ideologically as well, a natural ally of the Germans. They'd felt hard done by the end of the First World War, so they were a revisionist power. So that sort of general shake-up that the Nazis promised was something that could work in their favour, and they gained control over large chunks of Slovakia and Transylvania from the Romanians, so they territorially benefited from this alliance with the Germans. But at the same time, they were traditionally a nation that had quite friendly relations with the Poles. They saw each other as sort of fellow noble nations, as it were. So there's a traditional sort of amity between the Poles and the Hungarians. And this played itself out in Warsaw when the Germans brought in some Hungarian units, essentially to sort of hold the perimeter around the city. There were units that were considered not particularly battle worthy, but they could be used in some sort of security capacity. So they used to essentially to sort of hold the ring around the city. And in the process, it sort of allowed, given the presence of Hungarian troops there, it allowed those old amities, those old friendships in some instances to flourish once again, even though they appeared to be on different sides of the line. And there's a couple of examples. I think Alina's going to give us a couple of examples that we know of.
Yes, we do. We have a couple of examples. There's quite a few details that are known about the behaviour of the Hungarians during the uprising. Some of these men had actually lived in Warsaw for years, and others were deserters from Hungarian troops that were part of the German forces that you just mentioned, Roger. So in total, about several dozen Hungarians took part in the fighting. Many of them joined the Campinos Home Army group that we've already spoken about a couple of episodes ago, the forest up in the northeastern part of Warsaw. There was about 40 Hungarians also who joined that group. It was a work company predominantly that was made up of Hungarian Jews, and they performed predominantly auxiliary functions. They didn't take part in any of the fighting, really. My first actual example is a man called Istvan or Stefan Elek. He was a soldier of the 4th Hussar Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. He actually arrives to Warsaw from Prague on the 31st of July 1944, so the day just before the Warsaw Uprising. His unit was deployed in the northwestern part of the city, and they were stationed there for about 3 weeks, taking part in battles against the Poles and various different skirmishes and actions. And what's very interesting here is that the Germans actually allowed these Hungarian cavalrymen to move freely around the city, so they were able to take part in various other things and helping insurgents and whatnot. So then about tomorrow, so the 20th of August, he is transferred to an area in Powiśle, which is right down by the river, funny enough, where my grandfather fought. There, he, alongside many other Hungarians, ended up helping wounded insurgents in the hospitals. They gave food to the civilian population, and they helped wherever they could. Later on, they moved to an area called Puławska Street, and they were intending to become subordinate to the Polish command. So they were leaving the Germans and moving over to the Poles. During the talks, the Poles asked them for help, especially for the civilians who were fleeing the city, those who were terrified, who were at high risk, for example. And what they did is the Hungarians took about 2,000 civilians in horses and carts outside of the city. Then the unit was disbanded. After the war, Istvan stayed in Poland. He married a Polish woman, as well as several dozen of his comrades stayed with him. And then years later, he was actually awarded the Knight's Cross of the Order of Polonia Restituta for his activities during the Warsaw Uprising. So we can see in this example that they didn't just fight against the Germans, they also participated in things like aiding the insurgents, aiding the civilians, helping civilians escape. My next example is Henryk Vlasak. His code name was Vanya. He was actually a Hungarian filmmaker, and he served in the Office of Information and Propaganda. We've mentioned them before in previous episodes. Those that made films of the Warsaw Uprising, those who took photography, who helped with announcements, with newspapers, with information, helping it sort of spread around the city. He was also the author, amongst others, of photographs of the German attacks with tanks, in which the civilian population was standing in front of the tanks. So we do have evidence of that actually happening. And then the final one, we don't actually have a name for him. This was witnessed by Zbigniew Beka. His code name was Burza 2. He came from the Kikliński battalion. He remembers one night a Hungarian who escaped from the Germans ran in his full gear to one of the Polish posts in the cafe club. When he escaped from the Germans, he ran through Aleja Jerozolimska. We've spoken about this road before. It's one of the major thoroughfares through Warsaw. Roger mentioned about the most famous Polish barricade, the biggest Polish barricade that was across that road. So that's about where he escaped. He ended up taking part in battles with the insurgents, and he was extremely well trained. So that was a big bonus for the insurgents. He would dress himself in civilian clothes. So he fought for the Germans, escaped from the Germans, joined the Poles, and then went into a prisoner of war camp with his friends. He refused to allow his brothers in arms to go alone. And I think that's quite a poignant moment just there. I mean, these are not the only stories of foreigners taking part in the Warsaw Uprising. We will cover more as the podcast goes on. And a lot of these people either lived in Warsaw or fought on behalf of the Germans, or they were Allied soldiers or airmen, for example, as we've mentioned previously, John Ward. But just to round this podcast up a little bit, moving away, Roger needs to tell us a little bit more. We're having a Roger-filled episode today. Roger needs to tell us a little bit more about what the Germans are doing on the ground, because we haven't done that yet today.
Yes, a couple of sort of diary accounts which are always of interest. Erich von den Bach is rather lapidary in his commentary on this day. He talks merely about being in the various command posts in Warsaw and touring the city, and saying that the resistance of the Poles is becoming more and more fierce. So building really on the sort of rather downbeat and negative comment that he had the previous day. His colleague, SS Gruppenführer Heinz Reinefahrt, who we mentioned earlier on, demonstrated that however bitter the fighting, there's always room for a bit of sycophancy towards your superiors, because he wrote to the Reichsführer of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, on the 19th of August, saying, "From our Warsaw spoils, I take the liberty of sending you 2 packets of tea, along with my best wishes."
Well, that's the end of episode 19, day 19, and stay tuned for day 20, which will be tomorrow. Just thank you to everybody who has put those 5-star reviews up on their various listening platforms. We are so grateful. We have opened our doors to a couple of more new listeners from a couple more countries. Just to mention Spain, I got a message today on Twitter saying we have Spanish listeners. That's excellent. I can't remember how many, it was 40 odd, which is great. We're reaching other nations, hopefully letting you all know a little bit more about the Warsaw Uprising. So we will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone.